But yeah, Georgina said I'm the lead mobile developer at Seatfrog. Slides are probably a little bit older, but yes, Seatfrog. Seatfrog is a startup where our aim is to allow people who already have an economy class ticket on a plane to bid on any unsold business class seats. So say you're flying to LA, I think it's like about a 14-hour flight. I don't know about you, but I would really like unlimited champagne in a bed. So we give you the opportunity to bid on an unsold business class seat and get an upgrade for much less than what it would have cost you if you just bought it outright. But yes, to the talk. So I'm going to be talking about Dagger2 tonight, and in some ways dependency injection, because the Dagger2 is a little bit coupled in that respect, not very separated out. And just to get a bit of a census of the room, who actually knows what dependency injection is? Everyone, brilliant. You've ruined 2 of my slides. There you go. Who's used some dependency injection frameworks like Spring or Juice or... Oh, a few people. Who used the Spring when you had to use XML? Yeah, wasn't that fun? So yes. So I don't have to talk about dependency injection too much. So you all know what this is. This is just a really, almost looks like a smiley face of what lack of dependency injection is like. So everything is kind of creating its own dependencies inside of itself. Whereas if dependencies, we can kind of start breaking them out. And when you start to break dependencies out, they start to kind of look like a graph. So your dependencies are really a type of graph of your application. And that gives us a lot of power in that we can start doing things like what Dagger2 can do is at compile time, it can validate our graph. So Dagger2 does everything at compile time, unlike Juice or the old Spring libraries, where everything would be done with reflection at runtime. And on Android, that becomes very expensive because Android's implementation of reflection is terrible. I don't know what Nougat is because they're using the OpenJDK, I think. So yeah, Dagger2 doesn't use any reflection, so it's really, really fast. It generates all your kind of factory methods for you and kind of hides that behind the scenes, so you don't have to manually construct all your dependencies and inject them and then build the factories and horribleness. And if you use Dagger1, Dagger2 is actually a lot more easy to debug. So if for whatever reason your dependencies aren't really set up the way you expect, you can actually kind of dig in and see what Dagger2 is actually generating for you. And the best part, at least for me, is that it's ProGuard safe, because including anything from Google or Facebook just blows your method limit count. Like, what's it? I think including push notifications is like 30,000 methods or something. So yeah, as I was saying, so one of the problems I had with Dagger2 was just getting my head around the concept of a graph and how that actually kind of works. And I hadn't used Dagger1, and I must admit, I actually haven't used any of the Spring stuff either. I've in some ways been fortunate, in other ways I have not had the battle experience of going through that process. So in this case, we're going to define the kind of root of our graph. And in Dagger, this kind of subgraphs get called scopes. And in this case, we're going to define a singleton scope. And the singleton scope exists on our application, which in itself is a singleton. So everything that we want to have around in our application everywhere, we want to attach to a singleton scope, which is going to hang off our application. So to do that, we first need to define a component. And a component in Dagger is basically a declaration of what is in our scope. And in this case, we're including our application module. And a module is basically just a collection of dependencies. So in this case, we're going to provide a realm configuration, and we have to mark it as a singleton. So you have to tell Dagger what scope something belongs to, because the modules themselves don't really belong to a scope. A component kind of imports them, but everything inside must be declared as being part of that scope. And in this case, we've got the application module, which depends on our application object. And in here, we're just passing it into our dependent. That's not readable. So the modules are really good in that they allow you to wrap third-party libraries, but your code itself doesn't actually need to be in a module. You can, if you can read that, that says singleton. So we've defined our wrapper library for the Android resources class as being a singleton object, so it exists at that top level graph. So it's going to hang off our application object whenever we want to grab it. And to tell Dagger how to create it and what the dependencies of our class is, we just need to put @inject on the constructor. I believe if you have multiple constructors for an object, I don't think it works. I think then you need to use a module and then define all the dependencies and how to create your object that way. So now we're getting something that looks a bit more like this. So we've got all our dependencies. We've got a module which is encapsulating our database config, which in this case is a third-party resource. And we've got our own resource here that we've defined in the application resource. And all this kind of forms part of our kind of root graph. I swear I went through all these things and made all this stuff bigger. So we'll just make this a little bit bigger so you can actually read it. Nothing like live editing slides. So one of the things that the Dagger doesn't really tell you is where you put all these components and modules. The components and modules themselves can kind of just exist anywhere, but the way you need to kind of, how you inject that graph into your application, you need to attach it to your kind of application object, which in this case we're just going to do in our onCreate, and this is where we satisfy dependencies of any modules that we have. So we're telling the module here that we're going to provide it with the application. And if any of your own classes require an application, the module is the thing which provides access to that object. And if, so we can, where was it? Ah, here we are. So application resource needs their application, which we're providing in the module here. So we go up the graph and then down until we find what we need and then grab it. So if anyone's kind of new to Android, the way in which you extend the application is just go into your manifest and give the name of the thing. If you can't read that, just Google. They own Android. So now we've got our kind of root graph, but that's really great for providing kind of high-level resources like the HTTP client, retrofit. What else do I put in there? I don't know, other things. So what we can do is we can start extending our graph, and what we can do is we can define an activity scope. So if you're using something like the model view presenter pattern, this is probably a reasonable place to put things like your presenters, which are usually hanging off your activities. And the singleton scope is defined by us by Dagger. But if we want to define our own scopes, it's a bit hard to read. I see people squinting. So if we want to define our own scopes, we have to kind of create our own annotation. In this case, we're just going to create a per activity annotation for things like presenters or on-click listeners that we're just going to inject in rather than renewing up inside our activities. And the way in which we extend the graph is that we define what's called a subcomponent. I would have preferred the name subgraph, but I'm just picky. And we say that the subcomponent belongs to the activity scope. And we can define a module for this as well. And again, we just need to, for anything which, like for any dependencies on activities in a bunch of classes, we can define activity in here and then provide it out. You don't have to put provides as a prefix, it's more of a convention. And the same thing with just kind of general classes. You just need to put the scope at the top of the class, and then you need to mark the constructor with an inject. And the way we attach this subgraph to our root graph is that we, in the component for the application, we just need to say that the root graph provides the subgraph, and then any dependencies of the subgraph or modules that we need to pass in, we will do that here. Generally, you only really have one, which is the activity module, and then everything else you can kind of just hang off it. So now we're starting to get something which is looking a bit more complex. So we've got an activity, and the activity's got a bunch of dependents that it needs. Generally, what I'll do is I'll attach a component per activity. You don't have to do that. If you have things which kind of share a common dependency, you can just use like an abstract component which you just kind of, and then, that you just kind of share amongst your activities. And then when you need stuff which is specific to a screen, then you subclass and then extend that. So the way in which so that's how we kind of define the graph. The way in which we inject the graph into the application is that we add these magical void insert methods. I don't know if the name actually means anything. I just haven't actually tried anything else. But in here, we define classes which depend upon this scope that we then want Dagger to satisfy the dependencies of. So in this case, we have a dependency in our application class on the realm config that we defined in the application module. And the way in which we get that is that we get our application component, which we created a few slides back, and then we call the inject and then pass ourselves in. And what Dagger will do is it will look at our class for any kind of inject methods or inject annotated properties, and then assign the values from the graph into our objects. These need to be package public. If you want to keep them as private, you can add the inject onto a method, and then that will allow Dagger to inject the different dependencies into your package. Class, package, same thing. This may have been, yes. All right, I'm with it now. So the way in which you inject the component into the activity is that we just grab the root scope off the application. We then create our subgraph, which our activity then provides the dependency for, and then we inject ourselves into that graph. And any dependencies that we require, Dagger will then satisfy for us. So one of the things Dagger doesn't do is it doesn't actually know what to do when you give it an interface. So what you can actually do is you can actually provide a kind of abstract module where you define the relationship between a concrete implementation and the interface, and then Dagger knows how to actually bridge that gap for you. You can also, if you have, this is quite useful for if you've got like string constants that you want to inject rather than just having statics everywhere. You can actually attach a name to a dependency in a module, and then the way you consume that is that when you define it as a requirement on the inject, you just provide the name here as well. Yep, and that's how you do it in an activity. So since I'm almost out of time, you can look at these later. This is how you set it up in a project. If you want to see a demo app, I will have a sample up on the website, on GitHub. That's the website. And oh my God, those are tiny. But yeah, you can look at these later. There's a really good guide that kind of goes into what I covered really quickly in a bit more detail and with a bit more explanation about how things work, as well as this guy's GitHub page. And I think the last few months he's gone on a bit of like a Dagger spree, so there's lots of kind of really in-depth kind of analysis about Dagger and like things like if you're having performance problems with your graphs being ridiculously huge, how you can deal with that kind of stuff. And here's my Twitter. And that's me. Thank you very much.